April 16, 1945. The skies above the Ruhr Valley shook with the thunder of motors. Flight Lieutenant Roland Prosper Beamont, called just B by his squadron peers, was secured in the cockpit of his Hawker Tempest Mk5, palms firm on the stick, ascending through cloud layers at 8,000 feet. The scent of aviation fuel mingled with the coppery bite of frigid air seeping past the canopy gasket. Beneath him, the broken terrain of western Germany lay open like a smashed mosaic. Pocked airfields, incinerated factories, waterways clogged with the rubble of a falling regime. The conflict was in its closing weeks, yet the heavens stayed lethal. Somewhere in that empty gray, the Luftwaffe's final frantic wager hunted. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the globe's first active jet fighter, a craft so swift it appeared to defy the very physics principles that ruled propeller-driven planes. Beamont's unit had been informed about the 262s. Each Allied pilot knew the stories by this point. Streamlined, twin-engined, able to reach velocities over 540 miles per hour, almost 100 miles per hour quicker than the Tempest, and 150 quicker than the respected Spitfire. They appeared from nothing, plunging from height like silver streaks, their 30mm cannons ripping apart bomber groups before disappearing again into the overcast. U.S. bomber crews nicknamed them blowjobs for how they just seemed to blast by fighter escorts. British flyers had grimmer terms. A few said downing a 262 was like attempting to hit a wasp with a sledgehammer. You required chance, timing, and a skill most pilots lacked, the capacity to foresee where the jet would be before it arrived. But Beamont possessed another thing, a thing his peers had mocked, a thing the ground staff had dubbed juvenile when he first revealed the alteration. Affixed to the interior of his windscreen right over the normal Mark II gyroscopic gunsight was a rough assembly of wire and hued beads, a self-made deflection sight he had crafted himself with materials salvaged from a wrecked German plane and a shattered timepiece. It resembled a kid's craft project, a humiliation in the cockpit of one of the RAF's most sophisticated fighters. When he initially fitted it 3 weeks prior, his wingman had questioned his sanity. The squadron boss had just turned his head and strode off. But in the 5 days afterward, that absurd mess of wire and glass would assist Beamont in attaining what no other Allied aviator had done. 7 verified victories over the Mi-262, the Luftwaffe's unassailable phantom. To grasp what Beamont accomplished, one must first grasp what he confronted. The Mi-262 was not merely a swifter plane, it signified a fundamental change in air combat. Conceived by Willy Messerschmitt and driven by dual Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines, the 262 began active service in mid-1944, almost a complete year ere any Allied jet fighter saw battle. Its capabilities were astounding. Whereas a Tempest might hit maybe 435 miles per hour in flat flight, the 262 flew easily at 460 and could sprint above 540. More importantly, its pickup and ascent speed rendered conventional fighter strategies useless. An airman could align a perfect shot, press the trigger, and see his tracers drop futilely astern as the jet just sped off. The Germans realized they possessed a victory weapon. If just they could manufacture enough, if just they could school enough aviators to pilot them, if just they could maintain the airstrips undamaged long enough to dispatch them. By April 1945, those if-justs had grown into impossible hurdles. Allied bombing had devastated German manufacturing capability. Fuel deficits kept whole wings on the ground. The Luftwaffe was digging to the depths of its aviator pool, dispatching youths who had scarcely 50 hours in training planes to meet veterans with thousands of hours of fighting experience. Yet the 262 on its own stayed deadly. Jagdverband 44, the crack jet group led by the famed Adolf Galland, remained active, remained a threat. These were not fresh trainees. These were the ones who endured, the experts, men who had battled from the Battle of Britain across the Eastern Front, and now took their final stand in the heavens above a perishing Reich. They piloted the 262 with the sort of hopeless genius that arises from awareness that you battle not for winning, but for delay, for pride, for the thin chance that history might recall you battled bravely. Against them, the RAF hurled all it possessed: Tempests, Spitfires, Mustangs, all superb aircraft, all totally beaten in flat-out velocity. The Allies adjusted with strategy. Strike the 262s during liftoff and landing when they were slow and exposed. Rove the airfields, get them on the tarmac. A few pilots got victories like this, but it seemed empty, like shooting fish in a bucket. The 262 in the air stayed nearly invulnerable. Nearly. Roland Beamont was not your average fighter pilot. Prior to the war, he'd studied engineering at Cambridge, and that critical intellect never deserted him, even in the bedlam of battle. He neared aerial fighting the way a mathematician nears a difficult equation. Deconstruct it, find the variables, find X. The issue with the ME-262 was basic. The gunsights accessible to Allied pilots in 1945 were made for battling aircraft that moved at comparable velocities. The Mark II gyroscopic sight in the Tempest was an engineering wonder, automatically computing deflection from target distance and closing speed. Yet it presupposed your target was not speeding up at jet engine pace. It presupposed your target would hold a fairly foreseeable flight line. The 262 did neither. Beamont had been pondering this issue for weeks. He'd reviewed gun camera film from pilots who'd fought 262s. He'd dissected the geometry of deflection gunnery, the skill of shooting not at your target's location, but where it will be when your rounds get there. For a traditional fighter, this was a question of degrees. For a jet, it was a question of a vastly larger lead angle. The normal sight could not compute it quickly enough. The human mind, flooded with adrenaline and enduring G-forces, couldn't dependably gauge it. So he made his own. Employing wire recovered from a German plane's elevator control lines, glass beads from a fractured rosary he'd located in a French church, and the small cogs from a broken watch, Beamont assembled what was, in effect, a supplemental reference site. It was not complex. It computed nothing. It was merely a visual reference aid, a method to school his eye to gauge the severe deflection angles required when fighting a target traveling 100 miles per hour quicker than he was. The hued beads indicated particular angles. The wire structure offered him spatial reference marks. It was rough, ridiculous-looking, completely unscientific. It was also potent in ways the regulation gunsight was not, as it compelled him to think in 3 dimensions, to picture the geometry of the intercept in a style the gyroscopic sight's tidy-lit reticle could not transmit. The other pilots chuckled. The ground staff believed he'd broken from the stress. Even his own wingmen looked exasperated. Just Beamont understood that the ridicule was irrelevant. Only outcomes counted. And on April 16th, he received his opportunity to show it. The Tempest vibrated as Beamont shoved the throttle ahead, the Napier Sabre engine's 24 cylinders roaring in reply. His section, 4 planes flying in a wide finger 4 pattern, had been directed to a reported glimpse near Rhine Airfield, a known 262 base. Information indicated JV-44 was working from there, which implied if they located jets, they'd be piloted by aces. At 12,000 feet, Beamont saw them. 2 silver forms ascending sharply to the north, vapor trails flowing behind them like chalk marks sketched on the gray fabric of cloud. Me-262s. Even from this range, their outline was undeniable. Swept wings, dual engines hung below, the hunting grace of a shark. Beamont pressed his radio. Tally-ho, 2 bandits, 11 o'clock high, ascending. The Tempest rolled sharp left, plunging to gain velocity. The Me-262s noticed them. They must have, but kept on climbing. Why flee? They were swifter. They could control the encounter. They were unbeatable. Except Beamont was not attempting to follow them. He was computing. The lead 262 was in a constant ascent, not yet at full power, still gaining speed. He observed the angle, the climb rate, the closing velocity as his Tempest dove. His brain processed the geometry automatically now, instinctive recall forged from hours of rehearsal with his makeshift sight. He disregarded the normal gunsight completely, gaze jumping between the homemade wire rig and the swiftly approaching target. The 262 pilot made his initial error. He presumed the Tempest would attempt to pursue him up, wasting energy in a useless climb. Rather, Beamont sliced inside the German's bank, leveraging gravity and his dive velocity to place himself not astern of the jet, but in front of where it would be in 3 seconds. The wire beads lined up with a spot in blank sky 40 degrees before the 262's nose. Beamont's finger tensed on the trigger. The Tempest's 420mm Hispano cannons thundered, dispatching 120 rounds per second into an exact pillar of airspace that did not yet hold an enemy plane. Then it did. The Me-262 piloted straight into the cone of fire. Cannon rounds laced across the left engine housing. White smoke burst out, then orange fire. The jet flipped inverted, from pilot action or control failure, Beamont couldn't know, and started an unmanaged spiral to the earth. He did not see it impact. He was already banking, seeking the second jet. But the second 262 was absent, disappeared into cloud, its pilot having seen something that ought not to be possible. A propeller-driven fighter not merely striking a jet, but foreseeing its flight line with such accuracy that escape was impossible. Beamont's wingman's voice sputtered on the radio. "Christ B, how did you—" "Form up," Beamont interrupted him. "They'll return." He was correct. During the next 5 days, the sequence replayed with the robotic certainty of a machine. The Me-262s rose to engage Allied bombers. Beamont's section engaged the interceptors, and on every occasion that ridiculous mess of wire and beads provided him the fractional second advantage he required. April 17th, 2 additional 262s eliminated over Münster. April 18th, 1 hit, made to crash land. April 19th, 1 victory. But the gun camera film was so sharp that RAF specialists reviewed it for weeks later, attempting to grasp how he'd achieved a deflection shot at almost 90 degrees. April 20th, 2 additional, a duo of JV-44 jets snared in a climbing bank, both breaking up under cannon fire before their pilots could respond. 7 verified victories in 5 days. 7 Me-262s, the Luftwaffe's miracle weapon, the jet meant to reverse the tide, downed by an aviator employing a gunsight that appeared to be put together by a preoccupied child in a craft class. The other pilots ceased their mockery. What they saw in those 5 days was an element that went beyond material advantage, an element the Germans had thought their advanced technology would make obsolete. The strength of human flexibility, the unwillingness to concede that better engineering guaranteed certain victory. The Me-262 was swifter, true, more sophisticated, definitely. But it was piloted by men who had learned a dogma of air-to-air fighting that was no longer valid, who had been schooled in strategies created for another sort of conflict. Beamont, with his salvaged cabling and clockmaker's accuracy, embodied something the Nazi regime had never grasped. That genuine technological dominance is not about making the finest machine. It's about making the finest system for people to operate machines well. The wire and beads were not sorcery. They were just an instrument that amplified his innate capacities, that rendered abstract geometry into a form his hands and eyes could handle quicker than deliberate thought. In a sense, it was the ideal analogy for the contrast between the Allied and Axis methods of warfare. The Germans made the Me-262 in a vacuum, a marvel of engineering that required godlike talent to use efficiently. The Allies made systems, linked radar grids, mass-manufactured planes with interchangeable components, training curricula that made average men into capable pilots, and a culture that supported improvisation and in-field changes. Beamont's self-made sight was never formally accepted. The RAF never produced it, never distributed it to other units. By the moment specialists concluded reviewing it, the war had ended, and jet-on-jet fighting had made the entire query irrelevant. Yet in those 5 April days, it signified something more vital than any formal doctrine. The concept that soldiers nearest the issue frequently grasp the solution better than headquarters, that an aviator with wire and instinct could beat an engineer's magnum opus, that war is finally won, not by those with the finest technology, but by those who adjust quickest. There is a picture, captured in late April 1945, of Beamont standing next to his Tempest. If you peer carefully at the cockpit glass, you can just make it out, that jumble of wire and hued glass glinting in the spring daylight. In his flight log, he recorded the 7 victories with typical British understatement. Engage several Me-262 aircraft. Satisfactory results. Satisfactory results. 7 wins against a foe that was meant to be unassailable. 7 minor victories in the final days of a dreadful war. 7 instances when a juvenile-looking alteration showed that human resourcefulness, not technological dominance, stays the final weapon. The Me-262 was a superior plane to the Tempest in nearly all quantifiable aspects. It was swifter, more sophisticated, more powerfully armed. It embodied the future of flight. But it failed because it was handled by a regime that had overlooked the most fundamental truth of combat, that wars are won not by hardware, but by the individuals who operate it, and by the societies that enable those individuals to reason, adjust, and ad-lib. Ultimately, Beaumont's wire and beads downed more than 7 planes. They dispelled the legend of certain technological supremacy. They showed that a free intellect, given the means and the faith to resolve issues creatively, will invariably find a path forward, even if that path appears, to those who cannot grasp it, like a child's plaything stuck to a windscreen. The jets dropped. The wire persisted. And in that basic fact rests a reality that goes beyond any one battle, any one war. That the human ability for adjustment, for inventive problem-solving when facing impossible odds, persists as the one edge no foe can design away. That was what they ridiculed. That was what prevailed.